Hello, I am Professor Maria Sobolewska and I am a Deputy Director of the Cathie Marsh Institute. I am going to talk today about data inequalities in the era of big data. Let's start with what I like to call the big data conundrum. From the point of view of scientists like myself who rely on data, I am a quantitative scientist. The big data era spells abundance, data abundance, but there are also problems with that abundance. And this really is the topic of my short talk today. First of all, even though there's this abundance of data, there are still data gaps present. And these data gaps are extremely consequential. There are a few consequences that I am going to highlight. But one of the big consequences from my perspective and my research interest is how these data gaps and how the use of big data can perpetuate inequalities. I specialize in race and ethnicity, and so race and ethnicity is really the focus of what I am going to be talking about. Lack of correct data, lack of enough data, lack of data breakdowns by ethnicity, for example, but also by other protected characteristics can not only perpetuate inequalities, they can stop us from finding solutions to these inequalities. So it can prevent us from proposing the correct problem-solving approaches, and it can prevent us from even knowing sometimes that these inequalities exist in these particular areas. But another problem before we get to those data gaps is unregulated use of big data. And I know some of these other talks in this series will be tackling that. There'll be a talk about privacy concerns and about how big data can threaten our democracy. So really, I am again going to focus on how the lack of transparency in the use of big data and how those negative uses of big data can perpetuate inequalities. In Cathie Marsh Institute, we have a center called the Center on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. This is the center that tackles ethnic inequalities. And this is the center that I am a part of. And the aim of the center is to document and highlight ethnic inequalities in order for those solutions to ethnic inequality can be found. The inequalities must be identified correctly, correct causal dynamics of those inequalities must be recognized, and then solutions can be proposed. In the era of big data, there are additional challenges that we will have to work with and we will have to respond to in places like CODE, the Center on Dynamics of Ethnicity, and Cathie Marsh Institute more broadly. One of the big problems with the data gaps that I've already mentioned is that big data is often of questionable quality. One of the big descriptions of big data can be that it is a thin data. So by this, it means that it doesn't have a very good in-depth, it doesn't offer a very good in-depth view of what is going on. It offers us little glimpses because big data is not data by design. Therefore, it is just a trail, an electronic trail that we leave behind us in our everyday lives. As a result of this problem, we have those little snippets of knowledge that we gain from this data, but we can sometimes not explain it very well, and we have limited understanding of those snippets. As I said, the reason for this thinness of the data is that big data really is a byproduct. Therefore, it is not designed in a way that we as social scientists would have designed our data otherwise. We have very few predictive variables. We have to rely on what we have rather than ask questions and gather data specifically with that question in mind, which is the kind of traditional gold standards way of collecting data. This is a problem because even using more recent examples like COVID-19, it can be very difficult to find out why exactly, for example, certain ethnic minority groups are more susceptible to COVID, because we have not designed data that we have as a medical study in order to find this out. We have to rely on what we have. and therefore use variables in the data that already exist. We do not have the opportunity to ask additional questions in order to find out if theories we might have from other diseases are correct, or theories from other areas of inequality are correct. This is, of course, a huge problem, but it is not just the problem of the fact that we don't have this data. The problem is very complex, and I think sometimes, especially with areas like ethnicity, where investigations into ethnic minority groups are very expensive because they are minority populations, therefore harder to reach, therefore more money has to be spent on reaching them and studying them. What the big danger is here is that we are replacing the data we need with data we have. And this is a huge problem in big data. When everybody is very excited about big data, the government wants to jump on the big data bandwagon. We have to raise our hand and remind the government and other public policy bodies that we still need traditional data, data by design, data that is thick with those causal potential explanations and not just thin byproduct data in order to answer those big questions that we might have about, for example, ethnic inequalities, but also other areas of inequality like gender or poverty. A good example of replacing the data we need with data we have is the use of poor proxies. So let's say that we have only somebody's trail of that person's consumer behavior, and we are trying to explain it, but we do not have the correct and complete trail of that person's income or employment history, and therefore we are using proxies that are demographics instead to explain consumer behavior. So instead of looking at how somebody's income influences their consumer behavior, we look at things that we do have on file, such as what gender they are, what age bracket they are, or what ethnicity they are. And we'll come back to this problem of using those demographic characteristics as proxy later. Another problem, as I said already, with this replacing existing data we need with existing data is that some areas remain sadly under-researched. A very good example is a recent project conducted as part of the Center for Dynamics of Ethnicity, which is the first time ever that we have collected data on the ethnicity of local councillors. Ethnicity in politics and in representative politics in government is very important when we want to explain other inequalities, because lack of power often is behind not only inequality per se, but also lack of momentum to try to fix those inequalities. And so what we have found looking into this is that whilst we do care a lot and we measure equality and inequality, political inequality at the national level, we rarely look at those local level areas. And of course, this is a very good example of data that exists, that is out there, but that is actually quite hard to collect because it is across disparate kind of software solutions, different websites in different formats, and therefore it doesn't meet that kind of ease of a lot of big data scraping exercises. And so we have not been focusing on that, and we have not been measuring inequality at the local level. And we had to, as academics, step in and plug in that data gap. One of the big problems of big data, as I said at the beginning, another big problem, apart from data gaps, is, of course, using those proxies for measuring, for explaining certain patterns that we observe in big data. As a result of the fact that the data is thin, we don't have those explanatory variables which we ideally would like to have. We use other demographic predictors, other predictors that we do have in explaining a certain patterns. This is, of course, when I say we, I don't mean academics. Academics are trying to push against that pattern, but we as users of big data, so it can be anything from a bank to a other commercial company, or even governments. What happens then is what I refer to as unregulated use of big data. So as I already gave an example before, In order to explain certain consumer patterns, we might be employing proxies for income, such as where somebody lives, or what age they are, what gender they are, and what ethnicity they are. Using ethnicity especially is problematic, but also gender and other of these demographics, because some of these demographics is what we refer to as protected characteristics. These are characteristics protected by law because we know that they signify a lot of prejudice, discrimination, and inequality already. And so, using these characteristics in such unregulated fashion in order to predict outcomes to do with consumer behavior is hugely problematic, and it can perpetuate inequalities. Your bank might be less likely to give you a loan if you are an ethnic minority person, for example, if they use such big data algorithms showing that ethnic minority people might be less likely to repay the loan. And again, they would arrive at this conclusion because they were using ethnicity as a proxy for something entirely different. This is a huge problem because most of these algorithms are proprietary and we do not know what goes in them. So this unregulated use often suffers from additional lack of transparency. If you do not know how the sausage is made, you can hardly reject to eat it because it has ingredients you don't like in it. This lack of opportunity to appeal these decisions based on those algorithms is actually very well documented. And there are a lot of kind of popular science books on the market currently that highlight this problem. For example, Weapons of Mass Distraction by Cathie or Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble. So I am not going to go too deeply into these dark uses of those algorithms based on big data, just to highlight that it is a responsibility of academics to try to highlight those inequalities and those dangers and dangerous uses of big data. And Cathie Marsh Institute takes that responsibility very seriously.